It began on an ordinary morning in the heart of the city, in a building where every polished surface reflected power and every glance measured your worth before you spoke a word. No one in that lobby knew what was about to unfold, and no one suspected that the quiet man who took a seat in the corner was carrying something that would turn their entire world upside down. They judged him in an instant, speaking words they would come to regret, unaware that each insult was a step toward the moment that would strip away their certainty and leave them staring at a truth they could not take back. By the time the day ended, the same people who dismissed him would be standing in the shadow of a reality they never imagined, and the company they thought they understood would never be the same again. If you want to see how this all unravels, like this video, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from so I know how far this story has reached. The morning sun reflected off the mirrored facade, casting bright streaks of light across the sidewalk as he approached, his leather briefcase in hand, his navy blazer pressed and neat, the well-cared-for fabric betraying years of wear rather than the fresh gloss of something bought to impress. His black Oxford shoes shone, but the creases across them told their own story of a man who valued function over show. As he stepped inside the expansive lobby, the cool air and faint scent of polished marble wrapped around him. The space was a temple to corporate success. High ceilings, modern art installations, and a receptionist desk carved from dark stone sitting like an altar in the center. Marcus scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the people moving briskly from one point to another, all wearing the kind of expressions that spoke of self-importance and tight schedules. He made his way toward the reception seating area, choosing a chair in the corner where he could see the whole space without being in the way. His briefcase rested against his leg, his hands folded calmly, his posture one of someone comfortable with waiting. The moment of quiet observation was broken when Carl Benson, a stocky security guard with a rigid bearing, noticed him. Carl's boots struck the marble floor in a rhythm of authority as he crossed the lobby, his brow furrowed, his lips forming a line that suggested skepticism before he even opened his mouth. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Carl asked, his tone carrying that condescending edge Marcus had encountered too many times before. The question was not a request for information. It was an assertion that Marcus did not belong here. Marcus looked up, meeting Carl's eyes with a calm, unflinching gaze. "Yes, I'm exactly where I need to be," he replied evenly. His voice was steady, measured, offering nothing more than the truth without the slightest hint of irritation. Before Carl could respond, Chloe Hartman, the receptionist, decided to insert herself into the exchange. Chloe's perfectly styled blonde hair caught the light as she leaned forward over the desk, her lips curving into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "This area isn't for welfare clients," she announced loudly, her voice carrying easily across the polished floor to where several people were waiting near the elevators. A ripple of laughter followed almost immediately. Two men in tailored suits exchanged a knowing look, one of them chuckling under his breath. A young intern passing by bit her lip to suppress a grin. Chloe leaned back in her chair, satisfied with her performance, as if she had performed a public service in safeguarding the sanctity of the corporate temple from an unworthy visitor. Marcus didn't react outwardly. Years of walking into rooms where his presence was questioned had trained him well in restraint. Inside, however, he took note of every detail. The way Carl stood just a fraction too close, the deliberate volume of Chloe's voice, the audience's willingness to laugh without knowing anything about him. These moments were revealing. They showed you exactly who people were when they believed they were punching down. Marcus's eyes drifted to the large wall of framed photographs behind Chloe's desk, each one a portrait of Greystone's top executives. He noticed the uniformity immediately, every face white, most of them male. Across the room, a glass display case showcased awards for diversity in leadership and community impact, their polished plaques gleaming in a way that made the irony almost too sharp to swallow. The marble floor reflected the sharp lines of light spilling in from the street, and the quiet murmur of conversations around him did nothing to disguise the occasional glance in his direction, as if he were a disruption to the perfectly curated image of Greystone Capital's headquarters. His fingers rested loosely on the handle of his leather briefcase, and his eyes scanned the room with deliberate slowness, committing every face and every smirk to memory. It wasn't long before another figure entered the scene, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored charcoal suit. His tie knotted with the precision of someone who took pride in appearances above all else. Brad Whitmore, a mid-level marketing manager with a reputation for arrogance among his peers, was striding toward the elevators when his gaze landed on Marcus. Brad slowed, the corner of his mouth curling upward in a half-smile that carried no warmth. His eyes flicked down to Marcus's feet, taking in the polished but clearly worn Oxfords. "Nice shoes," Brad remarked with a tone thick with condescension, the kind of voice that turned a simple comment into a weapon. "Vintage, right? Or maybe thrift store special." The remark earned a chuckle from someone standing nearby, a younger associate clutching a laptop bag. Marcus looked up at Brad briefly, his expression unchanging, then returned his gaze to the sleek glass coffee table in front of him, as though Brad had never spoken. That lack of reaction seemed to annoy Brad, who lingered for a moment longer, perhaps expecting embarrassment or a defensive retort. When none came, Brad gave a short laugh and walked toward the reception desk. Chloe glanced up from her computer, and her eyes met Brad's with the familiarity of colleagues who shared the same smug sense of superiority. "He's been sitting there a while," Chloe said in a stage whisper that was far too loud to be private. "Maybe he's lost, or just killing time until his shift somewhere else." Marcus caught every word, the syllables sharpened by the deliberate volume and her glance in his direction. Brad leaned casually against the reception counter, his voice dropping only slightly. "You should tell him the Starbucks down the street has plenty of seats. This is for our clients, people who actually have business here." Chloe's lips curled into a smile that was just shy of a smirk, and she nodded as if Brad had made an excellent point. She turned her gaze to Marcus, and in a voice sweetened just enough to make the insult sting more, called out, "Sir, maybe you'd be more comfortable at the coffee shop down the street. We only seat VIP guests here." The way she said VIP was deliberate, the letters dripping with exclusion. Two other employees, passing through on their way to the elevators, glanced at Marcus and then at each other, the corners of their mouths twitching, as if they were in on some private joke. Marcus's eyes met Chloe's for a brief moment, not with anger, but with a calm that seemed almost unnatural in the face of such casual cruelty. He gave a small, polite nod, as if acknowledging her words but not her authority to dictate where he belonged. Inside, he was cataloging every move, every insult, and every witness. The precision with which they revealed themselves was almost artful. Brad, apparently satisfied that he had done his part to reinforce the unwritten social order of the lobby, turned back toward the elevators. As he passed Marcus again, he added, "Don't get too comfortable there, buddy. This isn't exactly the place for, well, He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. Marcus's hands remained steady on his briefcase. His breathing was slow, deliberate, every inhale and exhale a reminder that this was the moment before the storm, not the storm itself. He glanced toward the massive wall clock above the elevators, still time before the meeting upstairs, and let his gaze wander back to the reception desk where Chloe and Brad continued their low conversation, occasionally punctuated with laughter. Around the lobby, other people busied themselves with their phones, their laptops, their hushed discussions, but the undercurrent of attention was unmistakable. Marcus could feel it without even looking directly. Eyes that darted toward him and then quickly away, the subtle shift in body language when someone walked past, the tightening of lips that fought to hide a smirk. It was a small, self-contained world here in the Greystone Capitol lobby. And in this world, perception was everything. And perception, for now, was that Marcus didn't belong. He had been in this building less than 20 minutes, and already the room had drawn its lines. Those who belonged and those who, in their minds, did not. Brad's arrogance, Chloe's exclusionary tone, and the complicit smirks of passing employees had already created a quiet stage for what was to come. But Marcus knew the script wasn't finished. From his post near the main entrance, Carl Benson had been watching, his broad arms crossed over his chest like a sentry at a gate. Marcus could feel the man's eyes drifting back to him repeatedly, as though every minute he remained seated was a personal challenge to Carl's authority. Eventually, Carl pushed himself away from the wall, his heavy boots striking the marble with a deliberate rhythm. He stopped in front of Marcus, his shadow stretching across the polished floor. "Sir," Carl began, his tone clipped and official, "I'm going to need to see some identification." His voice carried just enough for the nearby employees to hear, their conversations faltering as they tuned in. Marcus looked up, his expression neutral. "Is there a problem?" Carl's jaw tightened. "Just need to verify who you are and why you're here. Standard procedure." Marcus's eyes flicked briefly to the side, where two sharply dressed men had just walked in, greeting Carl with a nod and strolling past without so much as a pause. No ID checks, no questions, no suspicion. Carl followed Marcus's glance, but said nothing. Marcus reached into his blazer pocket, retrieving a slim leather wallet. From it, he pulled out a driver's license and a sleek black business card embossed with gold lettering. He handed both to Carl without hurry. Carl took the license with a perfunctory glance, but when Marcus extended the business card toward the reception desk for Chloe to log, she pinched it delicately between her thumb and forefinger, holding it as though it might stain her skin. The gold-embossed letters spelled out Marcus Ellison Holdings, CEO, but Chloe's eyes skimmed over it with practiced disinterest. She placed it on the counter without a second glance and leaned slightly toward Carl. "We're not hiring," she said flatly, her voice just loud enough to carry to a small cluster of employees waiting by the elevators. A muffled laugh rose from that direction. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying her, but kept his lips pressed together. Her words were meant to reduce him to the role she'd assigned in her mind. Another outsider desperate for a foothold in a place she believed was beyond his reach. Carl handed the license back, but not without holding it an extra moment, his eyes scanning Marcus's face as if trying to reconcile it with some unspoken expectation. "You need to state your reason for being here," Carl said, still maintaining that faux neutral tone that barely concealed his skepticism. Marcus returned the license to his wallet and met Carl's gaze evenly. "I have an appointment upstairs," he said. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain with whom or for what purpose. The details would come soon enough, and when they did, they would hit harder for having been withheld until the perfect moment. Carl seemed unsatisfied with a lack of specificity, but before he could press further, Chloe slid the business card back toward Marcus with 2 fingers, as though returning a used napkin. "You can hold on to this," she said with a dismissive smile. "Like I said, we're not looking for new hires right now." Her tone carried the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to using politeness as a mask for insult. Marcus took the card without comment, slipping it into the inner pocket of his blazer. Around them, the rhythm of the lobby had resumed, but the undercurrent of attention was still there. He could feel the sidelong glances, hear the faint snickers muffled behind hands, sense the silent judgment hanging between the polished walls and the expensive art pieces. A young man in a navy suit passed by, giving Carl a friendly slap on the shoulder and breezing through without a word from security. Moments later, a woman in designer heels entered, heading straight for the elevators with a quick wave to Chloe. Neither was stopped, questioned, or asked for identification. Marcus's eyes tracked each one, his mind cataloging the contrast. He didn't need to say a word. Their actions were writing the story for him. Carl, apparently satisfied for now, stepped back toward his post, though his eyes lingered for a moment longer. Chloe returned to her computer, her nails tapping out a sharp rhythm against the keys. Occasionally, she glanced toward Marcus, as if expecting him to fidget, to get up, to leave. He did none of those things. Instead, he settled back in his chair, crossing his legs once more, his expression unreadable. She was leaning toward another receptionist from the adjacent counter, her lips curled into a smile that was more predatory than friendly, retelling her version of events from the moment Marcus had walked in. Her words floated across the polished stone floor, sharp and unmistakable. Some random black guy just walked in and sat himself right in VIP reception like he owned the place. The way she said it was laced with mockery, and it carried easily toward the elevators where a group of young employees had just stepped out, all clutching takeaway coffees and speaking in the quick, clipped tones of people on tight schedules. One of them, a lanky man in his 20s wearing a light gray suit, paused mid-step as Chloe continued, lowering her voice only enough to invite leaning in closer. I mean, he's just sitting there, like maybe someone's going to magically hire him on the spot. Carl had to check his ID. She laughed at her own retelling, and the young employees caught on instantly, exchanging grins as their eyes darted toward Marcus's corner. The laughter wasn't muted, it was open, careless, and underpinned by the assumption that he couldn't possibly hold a position that would place him above their ridicule. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled into a sharp ponytail, actually glanced over her shoulder to get a better look at him, before leaning in to whisper something to her colleagues that made them all laugh harder. Marcus kept his gaze steady on the lobby's entrance, his face betraying nothing. If they had any awareness that he could hear every word, they didn't care. Or worse, they assumed it didn't matter. It was a performance for each other, an exercise in shared superiority. The glass doors opened again, and in came Brad Whitmore, still exuding that same casual arrogance he had displayed earlier. He was alone this time, moving with the unhurried swagger of someone who believed every space was his to occupy without question. As soon as his eyes found Marcus, that familiar smirk returned, but this time he slowed his pace, clearly intending to stop. "Still here, huh?" Brad said, his tone somewhere between amusement and mild disbelief. He let his gaze drift downward again, taking in Marcus's shoes with the same condescending scrutiny he had earlier. "Listen, buddy, if you're looking for the job application desk, you're on the wrong floor. Delivery drivers check in through the side entrance." The statement hung there, delivered with a straight face but coated in derision. The group of young employees, still lingering near the elevators, heard it and burst into fresh laughter, one of them actually covering his mouth as if the sound might be too loud. Marcus turned his head just enough to meet Brad's eyes, his expression calm, but his stare unflinching. For a brief second, Brad seemed caught off guard by the intensity of that gaze, but he recovered quickly, chuckling as though he'd just scored a point in some unspoken contest. Chloe, from behind her desk, was clearly enjoying the exchange. She watched with an approving tilt of her head, her eyes flicking between Brad and Marcus, as though encouraging him to keep going. The dynamic in the lobby had shifted again, the air thick with a kind of petty theater that comes from people feeding off each other's condescension. Marcus understood it perfectly. These were small displays of dominance meant to reinforce an invented hierarchy. And right now, every laugh, every smirk, every sidelong glance was cementing their certainty about who they believed he was. But in cementing that certainty, they were also setting themselves up for the kind of reversal that leaves lasting marks. He sat back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on his briefcase, the image of composure. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the faintest trace of something in his eyes. Not anger, but calculation. Every word spoken in this lobby, every witness to it, every attempt to diminish him was being stored away, piece by piece. Brad, clearly satisfied with his own performance, gave a mock salute with 2 fingers and turned to head toward the elevators. The group of young employees, still laughing, filed in behind him, their voices carrying snippets of whispered commentary that Marcus could still catch. "Unbelievable," one said. "Right? Who just sits there like that?" Marcus had barely shifted his position when Chloe, perhaps emboldened by the approving smirks she had gathered earlier, decided that her little performance wasn't over yet. She reached beneath her desk, the faint sound of a plastic cup being peeled from a stack cutting through the hum of conversation. The water cooler behind her gurgled softly as she filled it halfway. Then she rose from her chair, heels clicking on the marble floor as she made her way toward Marcus's seat. In her hand was the flimsiest cup the office could offer, its rim slightly bent from the way she held it. She set it down on the small table beside him with a dramatic care that made it clear she wasn't offering hospitality, but delivering a prop in her ongoing scene. "Free water for temporary guests," she said, letting the pause before the last 2 words carry just enough venom to draw attention from the nearby employees. Her tone was light, feigning politeness, but the message beneath it was as sharp as broken glass. She smiled as if she had done him some small favor, and then walked back toward her desk without waiting for acknowledgement. The sound of quiet chuckles reached Marcus from somewhere behind him, likely from one of the seating clusters near the windows. He didn't look toward them. His gaze stayed fixed on the condensation forming down the side of the cup, the clear liquid trembling slightly from the movement of the building's air conditioning. It was such a small gesture, but its meaning was deliberate, a physical reinforcement of the idea that he didn't belong, a way to mark him as transient in a place where permanence and status were everything. Carl Benson had been watching the entire exchange from his post at the front doors, his jaw set in a line that suggested both impatience and a readiness to escalate. When Chloe resumed her seat, Carl took a step forward, his boots once again striking the floor in that same deliberate rhythm as before. He stopped directly in front of Marcus, casting his shadow over the table where the cup of water sat untouched. "Sir," Carl said in a voice that carried enough to reach the ears of everyone within 20 feet, "you're going to need to move along. This area is for approved guests only." Marcus looked up at him calmly, his posture unchanged. "I have an appointment upstairs," he replied evenly, his tone giving away nothing of the irritation anyone else might have felt in his place. Carl's eyes narrowed. "Then I suggest you head there now. If you're still sitting here in 5 minutes, I'll have to escort you out." The phrasing was careful, but the weight behind it was anything but neutral. Escort you out. Marcus had heard that phrase countless times in stories told by people who had been on the receiving end of assumptions. It was a phrase designed to remove someone physically, but its real purpose was to strip them of dignity in front of an audience. Marcus glanced toward the large wall clock above the elevators. He still had several minutes before his actual appointment time, but he had no intention of changing his plan just to accommodate Carl's thinly veiled threat. "I'll wait here until I'm called," Marcus said simply, his gaze holding steady on Carl's without so much as a blink. That earned a subtle shift in the air around them. A woman walking past slowed for half a step, sensing the tension but pretending not to notice. A man standing at the far end of the reception area lowered his phone slightly, his attention caught by the exchange. Carl seemed to realize that pushing further might create a scene larger than he was prepared to handle, so he stepped back, though his eyes stayed locked on Marcus as he returned to his position near the doors. Chloe, for her part, appeared to be watching out of the corner of her eye, her fingers tapping idly at the keyboard in front of her. The cup of water sat untouched beside Marcus, its placement as intentional as the words that had accompanied it. He could feel the weight of the moment, not in its capacity to hurt him, but in the way it was building a record in real time, a sequence of events that would later speak far louder than any protest he could make now. Every slight, every remark, every calculated gesture was a thread, and together they were weaving the kind of tapestry that would be impossible to deny once it was hung up for everyone to see. The low hum of conversation in the lobby shifted as the glass doors opened again and a tall man in an impeccably tailored navy suit stepped in, his polished brown brogues clicking confidently against the marble floor. Evan Cross, Chief Financial Officer of Greystone Capital, was a man whose presence drew immediate attention, both from those who sought his favor and those who hoped to avoid it. His hair was silver at the temples, but thick and styled with meticulous care, and his jaw carried the permanent tension of someone accustomed to being the sharpest voice in any room. He walked with the easy authority of a man who knew his title carried weight, scanning the lobby as if to confirm it was in proper order. His gaze landed on Marcus almost instantly, and in that moment, the atmosphere seemed to change. Evan slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing as if Marcus's very presence were an affront to the sanctity of the space. Without lowering his voice, he turned his head slightly toward Chloe, who was already half smiling in anticipation of whatever was about to come. "Who let this guy sit here?" Evan asked, his tone loud enough to cut through the lobby's background noise. The question was phrased as though Marcus were an object out of place, a piece of misplaced furniture that needed to be removed. Heads turned at the sound of his voice, and a few people who had been walking toward the elevators slowed their steps, sensing the undercurrent of confrontation. Chloe's lips curled a little higher as she responded, "He's been here for a while." Carl checked his ID. She didn't mention what the ID had said or the title embossed on Marcus's business card. details she had dismissed earlier with deliberate disdain. Evan's gaze swept over Marcus from head to toe, lingering just long enough on the worn creases of his shoes and the modest cut of his blazer to signal judgment. He turned toward Carl without missing a beat. "Move him to the maintenance staff waiting room in the basement," Evan said, as if the instruction required no justification. Carl hesitated for a fraction of a second, his earlier warning to Marcus still fresh in his mind. But the hierarchy here was clear. Evan spoke and others obeyed. Marcus's eyes met Evan's with a calm that belied the insult embedded in the order. "That won't be necessary," Marcus said evenly, his voice neither raised nor hurried. There was no edge of pleading, no attempt to explain himself, just a simple statement that carried its own quiet weight. Evan's brows lifted slightly, his lips parting in a smirk that suggested he saw Marcus's refusal as either ignorance or audacity. "This area is for our clients and executives," Evan said, his voice slowing as though speaking to someone who needed the rules spelled out. "If you have business here, you can wait downstairs with the maintenance staff until you're called." A faint ripple of interest passed through the onlookers. Someone near the elevators actually leaned subtly against the wall to stay within earshot. Chloe pretended to be focused on her computer, but her body angled slightly toward the exchange, as if savoring every second of it. Carl stepped forward, clearly prepared to carry out Evan's order, his hand gesturing toward the hallway that led to the service elevators and the less visible parts of the building. Marcus remained seated, his hands resting lightly on his briefcase, his posture unshaken. The pause stretched just long enough for the quiet tension to fill the space between them. "I'll wait here," Marcus said finally, the same tone he had used with Carl earlier, a tone that neither invited debate nor offered explanation. Evan studied him for a moment, the smile fading into something cooler, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest irritation at the lack of immediate compliance. He gave a small shake of his head, as though dismissing Marcus entirely, and turned back toward Chloe. "Make sure he doesn't interfere with anything," Evan said, his voice low enough now that it was meant more for her than for the room at large. Then, without waiting for acknowledgement, he strode toward the elevators, his reflection momentarily caught in the polished glass doors before they slid shut. Carl lingered another moment, his expression unreadable, then stepped back to his station, though the way his gaze kept returning to Marcus suggested the matter wasn't over. Marcus remained in his chair, the thin plastic cup still sweating water onto the table beside him, the silence between himself and those who had targeted him now more loaded than it had been at any point in the morning. Carl stayed at his post by the doors, but his eyes continued to drift toward Marcus every couple minutes, as if waiting for the moment to enforce Evan's instruction. Chloe sat behind her desk, fingers clicking rhythmically on her keyboard, the faint curl of a smirk on her lips suggesting she was already replaying the earlier moments for her own amusement. The elevator chimed and Brad Whitmore emerged once more, his energy high and his voice carrying across the space. He approached the desk first, leaning casually against the counter where Chloe sat her day so, he said with a grin that was far too pleased with itself. "Still here?" Chloe looked up at him, then flicked her gaze toward Marcus before leaning forward on her elbows. "We only have CEOs up here," she said with deliberate sharpness, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "and you're clearly not one of them." The words were chosen with care, each syllable designed to stab, not in the loud, theatrical way of earlier insults, but in a colder, more direct fashion. The people within earshot looked up from their phones and papers, their curiosity piqued by the audacity of the remark. Marcus's eyes lifted to meet Chloe's for a brief second. There was no anger there, no flash of offense, just a steady, unblinking calm that made her glance falter for the smallest moment before she recovered. Brad, picking up on Chloe's cue, chuckled and stepped closer to Marcus's corner. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just enough that it felt conspiratorial, but keeping it loud enough for others to overhear. "The board is meeting upstairs right now. Big decisions, high stakes. It's a place you'll never set foot in." He leaned back after delivering the line, clearly expecting a reaction, discomfort, embarrassment, maybe even a defensive protest. Instead, Marcus remained still, his hands resting lightly on his briefcase, his gaze fixed on Brad with the kind of composure that made the taunt land with an odd hollowness. Brad filled the silence with another laugh, as if to reassure himself he still had the upper hand. Chloe added, "He's been camped out here all morning, like he's waiting for a miracle. You'd think by now he'd have gotten the hint." Her voice carried just enough to ensure it traveled across the reception area to a pair of employees who had just stepped out of the elevator and paused, coffee cups in hand, sensing there was something to witness. Marcus noticed them too, the way their eyes darted between the speakers and himself, their expressions hovering between curiosity and amusement. This was no longer about a single comment or a misunderstanding. This was a performance being acted out for an audience, a series of escalating challenges meant to reinforce the same false narrative. Every insult had been built on the one before, each more confident than the last, fueled by the lack of resistance. And still Marcus sat, unshaken, letting the moments pile up like evidence in a case that was writing itself in real time. Brad shifted his stance, resting a hand on the back of the chair next to Marcus. "You should try the basement sometime," he said with a smirk. "Probably more your speed." The comment was accompanied by a few quiet chuckles from the onlookers, though the laughter was starting to sound a little less certain, as if some of them were beginning to wonder how far this would go. Chloe, undeterred, said, "He's stubborn, I'll give him that. But stubborn doesn't get you upstairs." Chloe had returned to her desk, pretending to focus on her monitor, but her posture was tighter now, her glances toward Marcus quicker, as if she was wondering whether she had pushed too far or if her opponent had simply run out of energy to respond. Brad had walked off toward the elevators, still wearing the self-satisfied expression of someone who thought they had the last word. The lobby's hum returned to its earlier rhythm, shoes on marble, the distant whir of the revolving door, the muted ring of a desk phone, but underneath it all, there was a thin layer of anticipation, though no one could have named its source. The elevator doors slid open again with a muted chime, and from within stepped a woman in her late 40s with dark hair pulled neatly into a low bun, her tailored charcoal skirt suit perfectly pressed. Janet Morales, senior assistant to Greystone's chairman of the board, was known for her efficiency, her discretion, and her ability to keep the highest levels of the company running smoothly without ever drawing attention to herself. She moved quickly, but with a poise that suggested she belonged in every room she entered. She was halfway across the lobby, flipping through a leather-bound planner as she walked, when her eyes lifted and locked onto Marcus. The transformation in her face was instant and undeniable. Her stride slowed, her posture straightened, and the faint color in her cheeks drained away as though she had seen something she wasn't prepared for. Her lips parted slightly, not in greeting, but in the sharp intake of breath that comes when recognition is immediate and unshakable. She stopped a few steps short of him, her planner forgotten at her side, her gaze fixed. "Mr. Ellison," she said quietly, though the question was more confirmation than inquiry. The use of his name was enough to draw a few curious looks from those nearby, but Marcus only inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. The shock on Janet's face deepened for a split second before she smoothed it over, glancing around the lobby as if to take stock of who might be watching. Her eyes flicked to Chloe at the reception desk, and in that glance there was something sharp, an unspoken assessment of the situation that needed no words. Chloe, sensing the change, straightened slightly in her chair, her smirk faltering as Janet's gaze lingered. Without another word to Marcus, Janet reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and retrieved her phone, tapping rapidly as she turned away and walked a few paces toward the far wall, just enough to put a thin buffer between herself and the rest of the room. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice low but urgent. "It's Janet." "He's here," she said, her tone stripped of its usual measured calm. There was a pause, during which she glanced back toward Marcus again, her brows drawing together with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Yes, now. In the lobby." "No, not announced." Her free hand gestured slightly, the kind of involuntary movement that betrayed nerves. "You need to know, he's sitting in reception." "Chloe's been," she cut herself off, perhaps realizing the sensitivity of speaking openly even at that distance. Her eyes landed on Chloe again, narrowing for the briefest moment before she turned back toward the wall, listening intently. "Understood. I'll bring him up personally," she said finally, ending the call and slipping the phone back into her blazer with quick, efficient motions. When she turned back toward Marcus, her expression had been schooled into a more neutral mask, but the quickened pace of her steps betrayed her urgency. Chloe tried to catch her eye as she passed the desk, perhaps to ask what was going on, but Janet didn't stop. "Hold my calls," she said to Chloe in a clipped tone, the kind of instruction that brooked no follow-up questions. Chloe blinked, momentarily stunned, and managed only a nod. Janet stopped in front of Marcus's chair, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. "They're expecting you upstairs," she said, though the faint tightness in her jaw suggested she was thinking of what had transpired here before she arrived. Marcus rose slowly, his movements deliberate, the leather of his briefcase creaking softly as he lifted it from the floor. Chloe sat rigid in her chair, replaying the scene in her head, her earlier confidence eroding as she tried to piece together why Janet, one of the most senior and trusted people in the company, had not only recognized Marcus by name, but addressed him with the kind of respect Chloe herself had withheld so deliberately. Carl shifted near the entrance, his eyes darting between Chloe and the now closed elevator doors, a frown settling on his face. He was still thinking about Evan Cross's earlier command to remove Marcus from the lobby when the sudden crackle of his radio cut through the quiet. Lifting it to his ear, Carl listened intently, his brow furrowing for a moment before his posture changed almost imperceptibly. The voice on the other end was calm but firm, issuing instructions in short, clipped sentences. Carl's eyes flicked toward Chloe, then toward the elevators, then back to the ground as if weighing the gravity of what he was hearing. When he lowered the radio, he didn't resume his usual stance of casual authority. Instead, he walked toward Chloe's desk with a slow, measured pace, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and awkward obligation. "Chloe," he said quietly, leaning slightly toward her, "we might have misunderstood who that was." Chloe turned sharply, her mouth half open to respond, but before she could speak, Carl stepped away from her and toward the path Marcus and Janet had taken minutes earlier. Even though Marcus was gone, Carl seemed to feel the need to address the air he'd left behind, as if his apology had to be spoken out loud regardless of whether the man was present to hear it. "If he comes back through here, Carl stopped himself, exhaling heavily. "I'll make it right." Chloe stared at him, her confusion deepening into something else, something that felt uncomfortably like unease. She opened her mouth again to ask for clarification, but before she could, the elevator chimed, and Evan Cross stepped out in a rush, his earlier polished composure replaced by a sharp urgency. His gaze swept the lobby, landing on Chloe with the intensity of a man looking for an answer he didn't want to hear. "Where is he?" Evan demanded, striding toward her desk. "Upstairs," Chloe said quickly, her tone uncertain now. Janet took him up. "She." Evan cut her off with a raised hand, already moving toward the elevators again. But then something in his expression shifted, as if a thought had just caught him mid-stride. He turned back toward Chloe, the irritation from earlier nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a practiced politeness in his features, the kind he reserved for important clients or senior executives. "When he comes back down," Evan said, his voice measured now, "you treat him with the utmost respect. Offer him whatever he needs." Chloe blinked, struggling to process the whiplash in tone. Of course," she said, her voice faltering slightly. Evan's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as though silently assessing whether she understood the magnitude of her mistake. Then he turned and gestured for Carl to follow him to the elevators. "Let's make sure the boardroom is ready," Evan said, the words carrying a weight that told Carl this was not a request. The two men stepped inside, the mirrored elevator doors reflecting Chloe's stunned face back at her as they slid shut. Left alone in the reception space, Chloe found herself sitting more stiffly than usual, the air around her feeling warmer, heavier. She glanced at the untouched plastic cup still sitting on the table where Marcus had been, its side slick with condensation, the small ring of moisture beneath it marking the spot he had occupied for so long under her scrutiny. It wasn't just the cup that unnerved her. It was the dawning realization that her certainty about who he was, the foundation of every barb and dismissal she'd aimed at him, might not only have been wrong but disastrously so. She tapped her keyboard aimlessly, not focusing on the screen, her ears tuned to the occasional muffled sounds of movement above her on the executive floor. Somewhere up there, Marcus was now in the company of the very people she had believed would never grant him access, much less welcome him. The damage was done. She knew that instinctively. Even if he came back down with a smile and pretended the morning's events were nothing, the memory of her words would remain. And if his sudden elevation in status was any indication, those words might carry consequences she hadn't even begun to imagine. Carl returned to his post at the doors, his posture more subdued now, his eyes avoiding Chloe's. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, the silence settling in with a kind of permanence. Marcus stood beside her with the same calm posture he had maintained all morning, his briefcase resting easily in his grip, his gaze forward but alert. When the doors slid open, they stepped into a corridor lined with framed photographs of past and present board members, the kind of hallway designed to project legacy and power. The carpet beneath their feet was thick enough to muffle sound, and the air seemed to shift the moment they crossed into the executive suite, a subtle blend of polished wood, expensive cologne, and the faint ozone of high-end electronics. Janet led Marcus past a pair of glass-walled offices where assistants paused in their typing to look up, curiosity flickering across their faces. At the end of the corridor, double mahogany doors stood open, revealing the Greystone Capitol boardroom. Inside, a massive oval table gleamed under recessed lighting, its surface dotted with leather-bound agendas and bottles of imported water. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sun catching the steel and glass of distant towers. Seated around the table were 12 members of the board, their tailored suits and subtle accessories marking them as people accustomed to having their words carry weight. At the head of the table sat the chairman, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a posture as straight as the high-backed chair he occupied. His eyes lit up when Marcus entered, and he rose to his feet, extending a hand with genuine warmth. "Mr. Ellison," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone greeting a peer, not a guest. "We've been looking forward to this." Marcus shook his hand firmly, his expression calm but assured. "Likewise. I'm glad we could meet today." Around the table, a few board members exchanged brief glances, perhaps wondering about the nature of the meeting or the man who had arrived without introduction in the lobby below. Janet moved discreetly to a seat along the wall, her role as observer and facilitator now complete. Marcus set his briefcase on the table, clicked it open with deliberate precision, and withdrew a slim folder embossed with the Ellison Holdings logo in understated gold. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady but carrying easily across the room, "I want to formally introduce myself. My name is Marcus Ellison. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Ellison Holdings, and my company is here today to finalize negotiations to acquire Greystone Capital." The words landed with the quiet force of a well-aimed strike. There was no need for volume. The content alone drew the reaction. Several board members straightened in their chairs, while others exchanged glances that mixed surprise with a swift recalibration of demeanor. The chairman gave a small, satisfied nod, as though confirming to himself that his decision to invite Marcus directly had been the right one. Outside the boardroom, the hallway was not as empty as it seemed. Brad Whitmore had come upstairs on an errand to deliver a document to one of the senior VPs, but curiosity had pulled him toward the source of the murmured voices beyond the open doors. He lingered just far enough down the hall to avoid being noticed, but close enough to catch the cadence of Marcus's introduction. At first, the words didn't register. His mind struggled to reconcile the man he had mocked in the lobby with the title he had just heard: CEO of Ellison Holdings, acquisition of Greystone Capital. The realization hit him like a cold wave, starting in his chest and spreading to his fingertips, leaving them faintly numb. He glanced toward the elevators just in time to see Chloe step out, her heels clicking against the carpet as she made her way toward him with a folder in hand. She was halfway through a greeting when she noticed his expression. "What's wrong with you?" she whispered, falling into step beside him. Brad didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly toward the boardroom doors, just as Marcus's voice carried out again. "Our proposal addresses the current weaknesses in Greystone's portfolio while leveraging its strongest assets. We're prepared to invest heavily in the infrastructure and leadership needed to take this company to the next level." Chloe's brow furrowed. She took a step closer, close enough now that she could see into the room. Her eyes landed on Marcus, standing confidently at the table, the chairman giving him his full attention, the board members leaning forward in interest. Then her gaze flicked to the folder on the table with the Ellison Holdings logo, and her stomach seemed to drop through the floor. The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost visible, the edges of her vision narrowing as she realized exactly who she had been mocking all morning. She stepped back from the doorway, the air in her lungs suddenly heavy, her grip tightening on the folder she carried until the paper inside bent. Brad's jaw clenched as he stared at the floor, his earlier arrogance collapsing into a knot of dread. In the boardroom, Marcus continued speaking, his tone calm but precise, laying out the strategic advantages of the acquisition, highlighting the alignment between Greystone's legacy and Ellison Holdings' growth strategy. Every sentence was deliberate, the product of careful preparation, but beneath it all was an ease that came from knowing he had already won the most important battle of the day, the one for credibility. Back in the hall, Chloe took a slow step backward, her mind spinning through the events of the morning with painful clarity. The snide remark about welfare clients, the pointed suggestion to wait at a coffee shop, the condescending delivery of a cup of water. Each scene replayed in her head with sharper detail than when she'd lived it, now colored by the knowledge of exactly who she had been speaking to. Brad broke the silence first, his voice low. "We're done." Chloe glanced at him, her lips parting slightly, but no words came. She couldn't even summon a defense, not when the truth was playing out just feet away. Inside, Marcus was wrapping up his opening remarks, closing the folder with a quiet snap, and meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. "I believe this partnership," he said, "will not only preserve Greystone's strengths, but position it for unprecedented growth in the years to come." The chairman smiled, nodding in agreement, and began to speak about next steps. The leather folder he had opened earlier now lay flat, its pages organized in precise order, each document chosen for maximum impact. Around him, the 12 members of the board sat with pens in hand and attentive eyes, some leaning forward to catch every detail, others shifting uneasily as the picture Marcus painted became clearer. His voice was steady, deliberate, and without a hint of theatrics as he began walking them through a series of slides projected onto the wall behind him. "Over the past 18 months," he said, clicking to the first graph, "Greystone Capital's operational efficiency has dropped by 11%, while overhead costs have increased by nearly 8%. This isn't market fluctuation, it's internal mismanagement." A murmur ran through the table as the numbers sank in. Marcus didn't pause for dramatic effect. He didn't need to. His evidence was irrefutable, pulled from Greystone's own internal reports and corroborated by independent audits. "In addition," he continued, clicking to the next slide, "client retention in your top 3 accounts has declined sharply due to unresolved service disputes. These losses amount to just under $70 million in potential long-term revenue." The chairman's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded for Marcus to proceed. Several other board members began flipping through their copies of the report, their brows furrowed. Marcus moved seamlessly into the next section, a series of documented compliance failures that had not yet reached public attention, but could be devastating if they did. "Your internal oversight flagged these issues," he said, pointing to a timeline of incidents, "but they were either deprioritized or ignored altogether. These patterns don't suggest isolated mistakes. They indicate a systemic problem in leadership accountability." One of the older board members cleared his throat, glancing toward the chairman, but no one interrupted. Marcus had the room, and they all knew it. What struck them most was not just the depth of his knowledge, but the calm, unflinching way he delivered it, as though he were describing the weather. No malice, no gloating, just facts laid bare. As he advanced to the final section of his presentation, Marcus shifted the tone. Ellison Holdings has the capital, the operational framework, and the leadership structure to address these issues immediately, he said. Our acquisition proposal includes a full restructuring of underperforming divisions, a new compliance oversight system, and targeted investment into the most profitable sectors of Greystone's portfolio. The aim is not to dismantle your legacy, but to secure it against the very threats it's facing now. He paused just long enough to make eye contact with each board member in turn. With the right changes, this company doesn't just survive, it dominates. The chairman leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, his eyes narrowing in thought. "You've clearly done your homework, Mr. Ellison," he said. "I believe we should move to a vote." The shift in the room was subtle, but undeniable. Board members, who had been reserved moments ago, now leaned toward each other, whispering brief comments and nodding. The chairman looked to the company secretary, who began reading the formal motion. Approval of the acquisition agreement between Greystone Capital and Ellison Holdings, with Marcus Ellison to be appointed head of operations effective immediately upon closing. "All in favor?" the chairman asked. One by one, hands rose around the table. A few hesitated for a breath before following suit, but in the end, the vote was unanimous. "Motion carries," the chairman said, his tone final. "Congratulations, Mr. Ellison." Marcus inclined his head in acknowledgement, closing the leather folder and placing it neatly back into his briefcase. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice as steady as it had been all morning. "I look forward to working with each of you." There was polite applause, but underneath it Marcus could hear the shifting currents, the acknowledgement of a new power dynamic settling into place. He knew that by the time word of this meeting filtered down through the company, the culture in this building would be very different. Outside in the hallway, Brad and Chloe were still rooted to the same spot where they had overheard the start of Marcus's introduction, though now their expressions were frozen in something closer to dread than disbelief. They could hear the muffled sounds of chairs scraping back, the polite cadence of congratulations, and they didn't need to guess what it meant. Brad exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "That's it," he muttered. "It's done." Chloe's throat felt dry, the weight of the folder in her hands almost unbearable now. The mental images of her own behavior toward Marcus in the lobby were no longer vague memories. They were sharp, replaying in high definition with every sound that drifted from the boardroom. Outside, Brad and Chloe tried to blend into the periphery, but there was no mistaking the way Marcus's eyes passed over them without the slightest flicker of recognition, as if they were irrelevant to his forward momentum. It was not a dismissal born of forgetfulness, but of deliberate choice, the kind that says a person has already been measured, weighed, and placed in the category they have earned. By the time Marcus returned to the lobby, Janet was already at his side again, updating him on operational matters and confirming the schedule for the rest of the day. As they passed Chloe's desk, she straightened instinctively, her smile awkward and thin, but Marcus didn't stop, didn't acknowledge her, didn't even grant her the small mercy of casual politeness. He moved straight toward Carl, who stiffened as Marcus approached. "Get me HR," Marcus said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Now." Carl didn't ask why. He tapped his radio, relaying the instruction with the efficient urgency of someone who understood that hesitation was not an option. Minutes later, in one of the building's smaller conference rooms, the head of human resources arrived, a tall woman in a slate gray suit whose expression suggested she had already been briefed. Marcus gestured for her to sit, then closed the door behind them. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice even but carrying a steel edge. "I want a full review of employee conduct, starting with interactions at the front desk. I want to know who has been engaging in discriminatory behavior, and I want it documented. Every incident, every witness." The HR director nodded without question, flipping open a legal pad and jotting down notes. "Understood. We'll start with today's lobby footage." Marcus's gaze was unwavering. "Start with that, but don't stop there. Patterns matter." It didn't take long before Chloe's name rose to the top of the list. Within an hour, she and Brad were summoned separately by HR under the guise of a follow-up meeting. The pretext was thin, and both of them knew it. Chloe's heels clicked against the tile in short, hesitant steps as she approached the conference room, her usual air of authority replaced by a tight, defensive posture. Brad followed a few minutes later, his earlier swagger erased, his shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for impact. When they stepped inside, they found Marcus already seated at the head of the table, the HR director to his right, a closed laptop in front of her. The air in the room was colder than the hallway outside, and the blinds were drawn just enough to block the glare of the midday sun. Chloe stopped short when her eyes met Marcus's. There was no trace of warmth, no hint of the easy composure she had seen in the boardroom, only the controlled stillness of a man who had nothing left to prove. Brad took the chair opposite Marcus, and Chloe lowered herself into the one beside him, both of them acutely aware of how small the table suddenly felt. Marcus didn't speak right away. He let the silence expand until it became a presence of its own, the kind that made people shift in their seats and look anywhere but at the person across from them. When he did speak, his voice was calm but unyielding. "I've had an interesting morning," he began, leaning back slightly, his hands clasped on the table. "I came here prepared to talk about the future of this company. What I didn't expect was to be given a front row seat to how some of its employees treat people they believe are beneath them." Chloe's fingers tightened around the pen she had brought with her, and Brad stared fixedly at a spot on the table, neither of them daring to interrupt. "I don't need to recount the details," Marcus continued, his gaze shifting between them. "You know what you said. You know what you did. And now," he glanced at the HR director. "So does the company." The HR director opened the laptop, the muted click of the hinge sounding louder in the tense room. On the screen, paused on the first frame, was a still from the lobby security footage. Chloe standing over Marcus's table with a plastic cup in her hand, her mouth mid-smirk. She pressed play, and the video rolled in silence, the events of the morning playing out in a stark, unbroken sequence. Brad's mocking comments, Chloe's pointed remarks, Carl's repeated ID checks, Evan's order to send Marcus to the basement. All of it was there, preserved in high definition with timestamps and camera angles that left no room for denial. When the video ended, Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on the table. "This is not just about me," he said. "It's about how you represent the company every time someone walks through those doors. And right now, that representation is unacceptable." Chloe swallowed hard, the reality settling in that there was no backpedaling, no reframing, no plausible explanation that could soften what was on that screen. Brad's jaw clenched, his usual confidence stripped away under the weight of Marcus's unblinking stare. The HR director closed the laptop with a quiet but definitive snap. "We'll be taking formal action," she said. "You'll be notified of the outcome by the end of the day." Marcus didn't look away from them until they both rose from their seats, the scrape of chair legs against the floor sounding like the final punctuation to a sentence neither of them wanted to hear. The HR director sat beside him, a stack of printed documents in front of her, each one a formal record of misconduct. Across the table sat Chloe Hartman and Brad Whitmore, their postures stiff, their faces pale. Evan Cross was there too, summoned from his office upstairs, his expression carefully composed in the way seasoned executives master when they suspect the outcome will not favor them. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping the three of them in silence for a moment before he reached forward to open the laptop in front of him. The HR director had already queued the files, and with a single click, the first video began to play. The image was unmistakable, Chloe leaning over her desk to speak loudly about welfare clients, her eyes pointedly shifting toward Marcus as she smirked for the benefit of the surrounding audience. The clip ran in real time, the tinny audio filling the room with the sharp cadence of her voice and the faint laughter of those nearby. Marcus said nothing, allowing the footage to speak for itself. The next clip rolled automatically, Brad strolling through the lobby, delivering his mocking comment about Marcus's shoes and insinuating that he belonged in a delivery job rather than in this building. The video shifted angles to capture him later, leaning against the reception desk and telling Chloe that Marcus should go wait in a coffee shop because the seats in the lobby were for VIPs. The HR director's pen moved across her notepad as the seconds ticked by, each moment of humiliation preserved in crystal clarity. Then came the footage of Carl's repeated ID checks, Evan's loud demand to know who had let Marcus sit in the lobby, and the order to send him to the maintenance waiting room in the basement. Evan's jaw tightened as his own voice filled the speakers, every word echoing with the casual authority of someone certain they were speaking to a man of no consequence. When the last clip ended, Marcus paused the playback and let the silence stretch. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, her hands twisting in her lap. Brad stared at the table, his jaw clenched tight. Evan's gaze remained fixed forward, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a recognition that the optics of his behavior were indefensible, no matter how he might try to explain them. Marcus's voice, when it came, was calm but edged with steel. "What you've just seen is not a misunderstanding," he said. "It is not a moment of poor judgment taken out of context. It is a clear and consistent pattern of behavior, disrespect, discrimination, and a failure to represent this company's values to anyone who walks through its doors." Chloe opened her mouth, perhaps to offer an apology, but Marcus raised a hand, cutting her off before she could speak. "I'm not interested in excuses. I'm interested in accountability." His gaze shifted to Brad. "You treated a guest in your building, any guest, with open contempt, not once but repeatedly. That's not only unprofessional, it's a liability to the company's reputation. And you," he turned to Chloe, "abused your position as the first point of contact for visitors to enforce your own prejudice instead of our company standards." Chloe's face flushed crimson, and she lowered her eyes. Finally, Marcus turned to Evan. "You hold an executive position. Your responsibility is to lead by example, to uphold the standards you expect from everyone else. Instead, you validated and amplified the behavior of those below you, reinforcing their belief that their conduct was acceptable." Evan's lips pressed into a thin line, but he did not attempt to argue. The HR director closed her folder and looked to Marcus. "Mr. Ellison, as head of operations, you have the authority to decide on disciplinary measures." Marcus nodded once. "Chloe Hartman," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt, "your employment with Greystone Capital is terminated, effective immediately. You'll be escorted to collect your personal items, and security will see you out." Chloe's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock, but the HR director was already sliding a termination document toward her, the formal language printed in cold, impersonal type. Marcus's attention shifted. "Brad Whitmore, your employment is also terminated, effective immediately. The same procedures apply." Brad swallowed hard, but he didn't speak. He simply nodded, though his hands were clenched into fists against his knees. Marcus's gaze landed on Evan last. "Evan Cross, effective immediately. You are relieved of your duties as Chief Financial Officer. You will be reassigned to a non-executive role while HR reviews your conduct in detail. Compensation and title will be adjusted accordingly." The blow was clean, precise, and public in the way that mattered most. It happened in front of those who had thought their authority insulated them from consequences. Evan's mask of composure cracked just slightly, a muscle in his jaw ticking as he gave a curt nod. "Understood," he said quietly. The HR director gathered the documents and signaled for security, who appeared at the doorway. Chloe rose first, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound jarring in the otherwise silent room. Brad followed, his shoulders hunched as if he could make himself smaller. Neither looked at Marcus as they were escorted out. Evan stood last, adjusting his suit jacket before walking toward the door with deliberate slowness, his eyes flicking to Marcus for the briefest moment before he left the room. When the door closed behind them, Marcus exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but with the measured control of someone who understood the necessity of the moment. This wasn't revenge, it was correction. The company's culture had been laid bare in the lobby that morning, and now it was being rebuilt from the top down. The HR director looked at Marcus. The large room was arranged with tiered rows of seating, the Greystone logo lit up on the back wall behind a sleek podium. Marcus entered from a side door with the HR director and the chairman at his side, his expression calm but resolute. Conversations tapered off almost instantly, replaced by the low shuffle of people settling into their seats. He walked to the podium with measured steps, setting his briefcase down on a nearby table, his gaze sweeping across the room to meet the eyes of as many employees as possible. When he spoke, his voice carried not through volume, but through clarity and control. "This morning," Marcus began, "I sat in your lobby for over an hour before my scheduled meeting with the board. In that time, I was greeted not with professionalism, not with courtesy, but with open contempt. There was a subtle stir among the crowd, a ripple of discomfort that moved like a wave from front to back. Marcus let the silence linger for a heartbeat before continuing. Some of your colleagues decided they could determine my worth based solely on their perception of how I looked, what I wore, and where they believed I belonged. They did not ask who I was. They did not consider that I might have legitimate business here. They assumed. And from that assumption came arrogance, rudeness, and a complete disregard for the values this company claims to stand for." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim black folder, opening it to reveal a single sheet. This morning was a test. Not an official one, not something the board planned or HR approved. But it was a test nonetheless, a test of character. Some people failed. And as of today, those failures have consequences. A faint murmur rippled through the audience, but no one dared to speak aloud. Marcus's gaze hardened, and he closed the folder. This company will not be defined by arrogance. It will not be defined by the willingness to look down on others for sport, or by the assumption that status gives you permission to treat someone as less than human. Those days are over. He placed both hands lightly on the podium, his voice steady but edged with steel. Arrogance and contempt for others will destroy your career faster than any missed target or failed project. Skills can be taught. Numbers can be improved. But character is revealed in how you treat someone when you think they have nothing to offer you. In the second row, a woman shifted uncomfortably, her eyes fixed on her lap. In the back, two junior analysts exchanged a quick glance, the corners of their mouths tight. Marcus noticed the small movements, the micro-expressions of people recognizing themselves in his words. He pressed on. "If you think this is only about the lobby or about me, you're wrong. This is about every interaction that happens under the name of Greystone Capital. It's about the moment someone calls our offices for the first time. It's about how we treat the vendors, the clients, and even the delivery driver who brings us lunch. It's about the way we see people, not just their titles, not just their clothes, not just their connections, but their inherent dignity as human beings." The chairman, seated to the side of the stage, watched Marcus with a look that was part approval, part calculation. He understood the significance of this moment, not just as a moral statement, but as a cultural shift. Marcus straightened slightly, letting the weight of the room settle again before delivering the next part. Effective immediately, mandatory training on workplace conduct and diversity will be implemented for all employees, from entry level to the executive suite. No one is exempt. Not me, not the board, not the chairman, and certainly not those of you who think your position makes you untouchable." He paused, scanning the room. It doesn't. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Several employees shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Marcus took a small step back from the podium, his tone softening but not losing its firmness. "You have a choice starting today. You can choose to contribute to a culture that respects people, that builds trust, that treats every interaction as an opportunity to strengthen our reputation. Or you can choose the other path, the one that ends where Chloe Hartman's and Brad Whitmore's careers ended this morning. And I promise you it will end." The room was silent now, save for the faint hum of the overhead lighting. Eyes were on him, but they weren't all the same. Some were wary, some were thoughtful, a few were even appreciative. Change was never comfortable, and Marcus knew this was only the beginning. He glanced at the HR director, who nodded slightly, ready to begin the rollout of the new policies. "I came here today to secure a business deal," Marcus said in closing. "But before that, I secured something far more important, the understanding that respect is not optional. It's the foundation of everything we do. And from this point forward, that foundation will be enforced. The weight of his words lingered in the way conversations stopped when he was near, in the way people seemed to think twice before speaking in tones they might have used freely just hours earlier. Marcus carried himself without the strut of a man drunk on newfound authority. Instead, there was the measured composure of someone who had long been prepared for this moment, who understood that leadership was not about basking in a victory, but about ensuring it meant something beyond himself. As he made his way toward the lobby, Janet Morales fell into step beside him, her expression one of quiet respect. "You changed the atmosphere in there," she said softly. "They'll remember today." Marcus glanced at her briefly, a faint smile touching his lips before fading into a more thoughtful expression. "They'll remember if we make it stick," he replied. "A speech without action is just noise." When they reached the lobby, the space looked different than it had that morning, though the physical elements were the same: the marble floor, the wall of executive portraits, the sleek reception desk. What had changed was the energy. Chloe's desk was now occupied by a young woman in a tailored blazer, her posture upright, her eyes attentive as she greeted a visitor with a warm, professional smile. There was no trace of the condescension that had tainted this same spot just hours earlier. Carl remained at the security post, but his stance was more reserved now, his eyes alert without carrying the edge of suspicion they had held before. Marcus slowed his pace as he crossed the lobby, his gaze taking in every detail. The new receptionist looked up, recognition flickering across her face as she realized who was approaching. She straightened in her chair, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ellison," she said, her tone carrying the respect of someone who understood both his position and his presence. Marcus stopped in front of her desk, his briefcase resting lightly in his hand. He let a few seconds pass, long enough to make the moment intentional. "I want you to remember something," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the same weight it had in the auditorium. "Here, everyone deserves respect from the moment they walk in. Whether they're a board member or a guest you've never seen before, whether they look like they can buy the building or like they're just here to ask for directions, it doesn't matter. You set the tone for this place, and that tone should always be respect." The young woman nodded quickly, her eyes steady. "Yes, sir." Marcus gave her a small nod in return, then turned to survey the lobby one last time. The wall of portraits still reflected a certain sameness that would take time to change, but he knew that change had to start somewhere, and it had to start now. He walked toward the glass doors, his reflection briefly merging with the city skyline beyond. The faint murmur of conversation from the seating area behind him was different now, lower, more careful, touched with the kind of awareness that comes when people realize the ground beneath them has shifted. As he stepped outside, the air was cooler than it had been that morning, the city's hum rising to meet him. He didn't look back, not because he was finished with Greystone Capital, but because the point of the day had been made and the work ahead was clear. The company would not change overnight, and not everyone would embrace the shift, but the standard had been set in a way that could not be ignored or undone without exposing exactly what they were choosing to abandon. The lesson was simple, but it was one too many people learned too late. Respect is not granted based on titles, clothes, or perceived status. It's the baseline for every interaction, the foundation on which trust and success are built. Those who forgot that would find their careers ending the way Chloe's and Brad's had, not because of a lack of skill, but because arrogance and contempt are weaknesses that rot any structure from within. As Marcus moved into the flow of the sidewalk, blending into the city's pulse, the glass facade of Greystone Capital reflected the sky above, its polished surface giving no hint of the shift that had taken place within. But inside, in ways big and small, the culture had been altered. The end. If you've been following this story from the beginning, you've seen every moment build to this ending. I want to know, what did you think about how Marcus handled the situation? Did the reversal feel satisfying? And was the message about respect and accountability something you believe more companies should follow? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. If you enjoyed the twists, the tension, and the final message, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Your feedback not only helps the channel grow, it helps shape the kinds of stories we bring to life here.